The courtroom smelled of old wood and expensive cologne. Rita stood alone at the defendant's table, her fingers gripping the edge as the prosecutor's voice sliced through the silence. Across the aisle, Carson Hayes sat surrounded by 4 attorneys whose watches caught the light like small suns. 15 years she'd worked in that mansion. 15 years of marble floors and crystal chandeliers and invisible hands that kept his world pristine. Now a necklace had vanished, and suddenly those hands were worth noticing. The prosecutor gestured toward her worn shoes, her calloused palms, the empty chair where a lawyer should have been. Rita's jaw tightened. Not from shame, from something else entirely, something years in the making that no one in this room could see coming. The courtroom doors swung open. 2 men in tailored suits entered with the kind of stride that made even Carson Hayes turn his head. And in that moment, everything about to unfold would remind them all. The people they never see are often the ones who see everything. The judge's gavel hadn't fallen yet, but Rita Morales could already feel every eye in the courtroom measuring her worth. She'd arrived that morning in the same navy cardigan she wore to clean the Hayes estate, the fabric worn thin at the elbows. Her hands rested flat on the defendant's table, calloused and rough from 15 years of scrubbing floors that cost more per square foot than most people earned in a month. Those hands trembled slightly, but not from fear of Carson Hayes. Rita had stopped being afraid of him the moment she understood what kind of man he truly was. The gallery filled with journalists, their phones already positioned to capture whatever spectacle was about to unfold. This case had all the elements that sold papers. Billionaire family, missing jewelry worth $500,000, trusted employee turned thief. The story wrote itself. Neat and simple, exactly how people preferred their scandals. No complexity, just villains and victims, clean lines between right and wrong, a maid who'd finally gotten greedy after years of being surrounded by wealth she'd never touch. Carson Hayes entered the courtroom like a man who'd never questioned his right to be anywhere. His charcoal suit probably cost 6 months of Rita's salary, fitted so perfectly it might have been painted on. Silver hair swept back from a face that had seen 60 years but looked 45, maintained by dermatologists and personal trainers, and the kind of stress-free living that money could buy. He moved to his seat with practiced ease, followed by his legal team, 4 attorneys in matching navy suits carrying briefcases that gleamed like weapons under the fluorescent lights. Patricia Kendrick, lead counsel for the Hayes family, was a woman who'd built her reputation on defending people who could afford innocence. She arranged her files with surgical precision, glanced once at Rita with an expression of cool assessment, then leaned to whisper something to Carson. He nodded, his mouth pulling into something that might have passed for a smile in poor lighting. Rita remembered her first day at the Hayes mansion 15 years ago. She'd stood in that marble foyer clutching her references, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone could hear it. She'd needed that job desperately. Her twin sons had been 7 years old then, bottomless appetites in small bodies, and she'd been scrambling between temp work and night shifts for 2 years since her husband died. The Hayes position paid well, better than anything else she'd been offered, and came with the kind of stability that felt like winning the lottery. Carson had barely looked at her during the interview. His wife Veronica had done the talking, walking Rita through 30 rooms that sparkled like jewelry boxes, explaining that the house needed to stay perfect. Rita would work 6 days a week, 8 hours minimum, more during parties. She would be invisible when guests arrived. She would be thorough, efficient, and above all, discreet about everything she saw and heard. Rita had agreed to all of it. She'd needed to agree. The prosecutor stood now, adjusting his tie. Gerald Hoffman had the particular confidence of a man who'd never lost a case this straightforward. He opened his folder and began in a voice designed to fill courtrooms and convince juries. "Your Honor, The state will prove that Rita Morales engaged in calculated theft of property valued at $500,000. On March 15th, a diamond necklace disappeared from the Hayes family safe. Mrs. Hayes discovered the loss the following morning. The defendant was the only employee with access to that bedroom during the relevant time frame. The evidence will show beyond reasonable doubt that Rita Morales violated 15 years of trust and committed grand larceny. The words landed like stones. Grand larceny, calculated theft, violation of trust. They made it sound so inevitable, so obvious. Woman who cleaned toilets steals from people who could buy her life 100 times over. Of course she did. What else would someone like her do when surrounded by that much wealth? Judge Helen Brenner, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and reading glasses perched low on her nose, looked down at Rita from the bench. "Ms. Morales, are you represented by counsel?" Rita stood slowly. The chair scraped against wood, too loud in the silent room. "No, Your Honor." "Do you wish to request a public defender?" Rita opened her mouth to answer, but the courtroom doors swung open before she could speak. The sound cut through the tension like a crack of thunder, sharp and impossible to ignore. Every head turned. The journalists shifted in their seats. Even Carson Hayes looked up from the papers Patricia Kendrick had been showing him. Two men entered, moving in perfect synchronization. They were young, late 20s perhaps, tall and broad-shouldered in dark grey suits that fit like they'd been made for them specifically. Their shoes clicked against the hardwood in identical rhythm. They had strong jawlines, dark hair cut short and professional, and the kind of presence that made people instinctively move aside. But it was their eyes that made Rita forget to breathe. Brown eyes, warm and steady, that she would have recognized in any crowd, in any context, in any world. Eyes she'd seen every day for 28 years, first in her husband's face, then mirrored in her son's. The courtroom watched as they walked down the center aisle with absolute confidence. Carson Hayes leaned forward, his forehead creasing in confusion. Patricia Kendrick's pen paused mid-note. The prosecutor stood frozen, his prepared speech forgotten. The first man reached Rita's table and set down a leather briefcase with the ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before. He looked directly at Judge Brenner, and when he spoke, his voice carried the particular authority of someone who knew exactly where he stood and what he was worth. "Your Honor, my name is James Morales, and this is my brother Robert Morales. We'll be representing the defendant." The silence that followed felt thick enough to touch. Rita's knees weakened, and she gripped the table edge to stay upright. James, Robert, her boys, her twin sons standing here in this courtroom in suits that cost more than her car, speaking with the voices of attorneys, of professionals, of people who belonged in spaces she'd spent 15 years cleaning from the shadows. Judge Brenner removed her glasses, cleaned them deliberately on her robe, replaced them as if checking whether her vision had failed her. "You're representing your own mother." "Yes, Your Honor," Robert said, and there was something in his tone, something hard and bright and utterly certain. "We are." Carson Hayes half rose from his seat, his face flushing. "Your Honor, this is absurd. These men can't possibly—" "Mr. Hayes," Judge Brenner's voice cut like a blade, "you'll have your opportunity to speak. Sit down." Carson sat, but his jaw worked as if chewing words he couldn't yet release. Patricia Kendrick leaned over urgently, but he waved her away, his gaze fixed on James and Robert with an expression somewhere between confusion and outrage. James opened his briefcase with practiced efficiency and withdrew a folder. "Your Honor, we'd like to submit our credentials for the court's review. My brother and I are both licensed to practice in this state. We graduated from Columbia Law School 3 years ago and have been working in corporate litigation since." He handed the papers to the bailiff, who carried them to the bench. Judge Brenner reviewed them with methodical care. The seconds stretched. Rita wanted to speak, to say something to her sons, but her throat had closed completely. All she could do was stand there watching as James and Robert took their places beside her, solid and real and impossibly present. Judge Brenner finally looked up. "Everything appears in order. Counselors, you may proceed." Patricia Kendrick shot to her feet. "Your Honor, the prosecution requests a recess to review this development." "Denied," Judge Brenner said flatly. "The defendant has a right to representation. These attorneys are licensed. We'll continue." James turned to Rita for the first time since entering. Up close, she could see the fine lines starting around his eyes, the slight shadow of stubble along his jaw. He'd grown up. They both had. Somewhere between the last time she'd seen them 6 months ago and this moment, they'd stopped being her little boys and become men she barely recognized. "Mom," James said quietly, pitched only for her. "Sit down. We've got this." Rita sat. Her hand still shook, but now from something else entirely. Relief, terror, pride so fierce it felt too large for her chest. She'd raised them alone after their father died, worked 3 jobs some years to keep them fed and in decent schools. She'd hidden them from the Hayes family, never mentioning that the woman scrubbing their marble had sons in college, because she'd learned early that people like Carson and Veronica didn't want their help to have complicated lives. They wanted simplicity. They wanted someone who existed only to serve their needs. So Rita had been simple, quiet, invisible. Until now. Robert stepped forward, his posture relaxed, but his voice carrying steel underneath. "Your Honor, the defense moves to dismiss all charges against Rita Morales on grounds of insufficient evidence and prosecutorial misconduct," Hoffman sputtered. "Your Honor, that's outrageous. You have circumstantial evidence," James interrupted smoothly, not looking at the prosecutor. "You have assumptions and prejudice. You don't have proof. No witnesses, no forensics, no actual evidence linking my mother to any theft." Patricia Kendrick stood. "Your Honor, the defendant had access and opportunity. The necklace disappeared from a locked safe. She knew the combination. No one else was present that evening." "No one else that you know of?" Robert said, and something in his voice made the journalists lean forward with sudden interest. "Tell me, Ms. Kendrick, did your investigators review security footage from the Hayes estate that night?" Patricia hesitated just long enough to be noticeable. "The security system was offline for maintenance." "Convenient," James murmured, just loud enough to carry. Carson Hayes stood abruptly, his face fully flushed now. "Your Honor, I will not sit here and be accused of—" "Mr. Hayes!" Judge Brenner's voice cut through his protest. "Sit down." He obeyed this time, but fury radiated from him in waves. Rita watched from across the aisle and saw something she'd never noticed in 15 years of working in his house. Fear. Beneath the anger and indignation, Carson Hayes was afraid. Robert pulled a document from his briefcase. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit evidence not included in the prosecution's discovery. Phone records showing that on March 15th, Veronica Hayes received 17 calls from a number registered to Atlantic City Casino. Bank statements showing she withdrew $75,000 in cash over the previous month. Credit card statements with purchases at 3 different pawn shops in New Jersey." The courtroom erupted. Journalists whispered urgently. Hoffman turned to Patricia Kendrick with his mouth hanging open. Carson Hayes went completely still, color draining from his face like water from a broken glass. Judge Brenner's gavel cracked down. "Order. I will have order." The noise subsided, but the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. Rita stared at Robert, at the papers in his hand, at the calm, professional way he'd just detonated a bomb in the middle of the prosecution's case. She'd known her sons were smart. She'd always known. But this was something else entirely. This was power. James stepped forward, his voice measured and precise. Your Honor, the defense contends there was no theft. Veronica Hayes pawned her own necklace to cover gambling debts, then fabricated a theft to collect insurance money and avoid explaining where the necklace actually went. She chose to blame Rita Morales because my mother was convenient. A woman without resources, without connections, without means to defend herself properly. Patricia Kendrick was standing again. Your Honor, these allegations are baseless slander. The Hayes family has a reputation to protect. Robert finished smoothly. We understand, but reputation doesn't trump truth, Counselor. Judge Brenner studied the documents Robert had submitted, her expression unreadable. Mr. Hoffman, did you review any of this evidence during your investigation? The prosecutor looked like someone who'd just discovered quicksand under his feet. Your Honor, we based our case on information provided by Mr. and Mrs. Hayes and their private investigator. That's a no, Judge Brenner said flatly. She turned to Carson. Mr. Hayes, where is your wife? Carson's jaw worked. She's unwell, Your Honor. Unable to attend today. Convenient timing, James observed. She's been unwell since the day after my mother's arrest. Judge Brenner's expression hardened. Mr. Hoffman, I'm inclined to grant the defense motion. You've brought charges on incomplete evidence and failed to investigate basic alternative scenarios. Your Honor. Patricia tried again, but her voice had lost its edge. The Hayes family trusted Miss Morales for 15 years and paid her barely above minimum wage while working her 6 days a week. Robert interrupted. No health insurance, no vacation time, no basic dignity. Tell me, Miss Kendrick, did Mr. Hayes ever learn my mother's sons' names in 15 years? Carson didn't answer. The silence said everything. Something broke open in Rita's chest. Not grief exactly, but close. Maybe relief, maybe vindication. She'd spent 15 years making herself small, invisible, telling herself it didn't matter that Carson never acknowledged her birthday, or that Veronica never said thank you. The job was enough. The money was enough. Keeping her head down was survival. But it had mattered. Every dismissive glance, every conversation that stopped when she entered rooms, every time they discussed her like furniture. All of it had mattered. James turned to face Carson directly. You want to know the real irony, Mr. Hayes? My mother never told you about us. She knew you'd see sons as complications, distractions from her real job, making sure you never had to think about who cleaned up after you. She worked 3 jobs to put us through college, Robert added, controlled anger threading his voice. Worked herself to exhaustion so we could have opportunities she never had. And the entire time, you treated her like she didn't exist unless something needed cleaning. Judge Brenner's gavel came down. Gentlemen, this is a courtroom. Mr. Hoffman, do you wish to proceed given the evidence presented? The prosecutor looked at Patricia, who looked at Carson, who looked at nothing. The silence stretched thick and heavy. Finally, Hoffman stood. Your Honor, the state requests time to review new evidence and conduct further investigation. The state had 3 months to investigate properly, Judge Brenner said sharply. Motion to dismiss granted. All charges against Rita Morales are dropped effective immediately. The gavel came down with finality. Court adjourned. The room exploded into noise. Journalists rushed for exits and phones. Hoffman gathered files with jerky movements. Patricia leaned urgently toward Carson, whose face had gone gray as old paper. Rita sat perfectly still. Charges dropped. Over. After 3 months of sleepless nights and mounting terror that no one would believe her, it was over. James and Robert turned to her simultaneously. For a moment they just looked at each other. 3 people connected by blood and sacrifice, and years of struggle that had brought them to this impossible moment. Then Robert smiled slightly and said, "Hey, Mom." Rita stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. The courtroom chaos swirled around them, journalists shouting questions, Patricia Kendrick trying to shield Carson from cameras, the bailiff calling for order. But all of it felt distant, muffled, like watching a storm through thick glass. Her sons stood before her in their expensive suits, and for a moment, Rita couldn't reconcile these confident attorneys with the 7-year-old boys who used to fall asleep in her lap after long days at school. "You came," she managed to say, her voice hoarse. "Of course we came," James said, and something fierce burned in his eyes. "Did you really think we wouldn't?" "I told you not to. I said I could handle it." Rita's hands twisted together, the calluses on her palms catching on each other. "I didn't want you to see me like this. Standing here accused, looking like—" "Like what?" Robert interrupted gently. "Like someone who got targeted because she seemed easy to blame. Like someone who spent 15 years being invisible to people who should have seen her worth." Rita's throat closed. She'd spent 3 months convincing herself this was something she had to face alone, that her sons had their own lives and careers to protect, that dragging them into her mess would only hurt them. She'd been wrong. James touched her elbow lightly. "Come on, let's get out of here before the media circus gets worse." They moved as a unit toward the exit, James and Robert flanking Rita like bodyguards. Journalists tried to intercept them, microphones thrust forward, cameras flashing, but her sons cut through the chaos with the kind of practiced efficiency that spoke of courtroom experience. They'd done this before, Rita realized. Not for her, but for clients, for cases, for the work they'd built in the 3 years since law school. Outside, the late afternoon sun hit Rita's face, warm and bright. She stopped on the courthouse steps, just breathing. Free air felt different somehow, lighter. The charges were gone, but more than that, the weight of Carson Hayes' accusation, the shame she'd carried for 3 months, the fear that she'd be convicted, and her sons would have to watch their mother labeled a criminal. All of it lifted like fog burning off in sunlight. "How did you know?" Rita asked as they walked toward the parking lot. "About Veronica's gambling, the pawn shops, all of it." James and Robert exchanged a glance, some wordless communication passing between them the way it had since they were children. Finally, James spoke. "When you called 3 months ago to tell us you'd been arrested, you sounded scared in a way I'd never heard before. You kept saying it was fine, you could handle it, don't worry about coming home, which told us immediately that it wasn't fine at all. We hired a private investigator that same day," Robert continued. "Cost us most of our savings, but it was worth every penny. He started digging into the Hayes family finances, looking for anything that didn't add up. It didn't take long," James added. "Veronica Hayes has a gambling problem that Carson's been covering up for years. She's been banned from 3 casinos in Atlantic City. The family's private investigator knew about it, but they buried that information when they gave everything to the prosecutor." Rita stopped walking. "You spent your savings on me?" "Mom." Robert's voice was patient but firm. "You worked 3 jobs to put us through college. You wore the same winter coat for 8 years because new ones were expensive. You ate ramen for dinner so we could have real meals. Did you really think we'd let you face this alone?" "I'm supposed to take care of you," Rita said, and her voice cracked on the words. "Not the other way around." "We're adults now," James said quietly. "Let us carry some weight for once." They reached a sleek black sedan that looked like it belonged in a different world from Rita's 12-year-old Honda. Robert unlocked it with a key fob, and they climbed in, Rita in the back, her sons in front. The interior smelled like leather and success, and Rita felt profoundly out of place. "Is this really yours?" she asked. "Company car," James said, starting the engine. Part of the benefits package at the firm. Tell me about your work, Rita said. I want to hear everything. I know you've been busy, but I've only gotten bits and pieces over the phone. As James navigated through city traffic, both brothers took turns describing their lives. They worked for a mid-sized corporate litigation firm in Manhattan, handling contract disputes and business negotiations. The hours were brutal, 60, sometimes 70 hours a week, but the work was engaging and the pay was good. They'd moved into a 2-bedroom apartment together in Brooklyn to save money and support each other through the grind. We're not rich, Robert clarified, glancing back at her. Not even close. But we're stable. Building something. You're more than stable, Rita said softly. You walked into that courtroom like you owned it. We've had practice, James admitted. Corporate litigation isn't as dramatic as what happened today. But you learn how to present yourself, how to command a room, how to make people listen even when they'd rather dismiss you. Rita heard the subtext underneath his words. Even with their education and credentials, her sons had faced their own battles. Young attorneys, still proving themselves, working twice as hard to earn respect that came easier to others. They'd learned to be impressive because anything less meant being overlooked. I'm proud of you, Rita said, and her voice shook. I've always been proud, but seeing you today, we learned from the best. Robert interrupted gently. You think we don't know what you did? How you made yourself small so Carson Hayes would feel big? How you swallowed every insult and dismissal because the job paid for our futures? That wasn't strength, Rita protested. That was just survival. It was both, James said firmly. And it taught us what real courage looks like. Not the loud kind that demands attention. The quiet kind that keeps going even when everything hurts. They drove through neighborhoods Rita recognized from years of cleaning houses, past the elementary school where her boys had attended on scholarships, past the small apartment building where they'd lived in a cramped 2-bedroom for 15 years, past the life she'd built from nothing after her husband died, piece by painful piece. James pulled into a parking spot outside a modest restaurant, the kind with checkered tablecloths and waitresses who called everyone honey. Inside, they settled into a corner booth. The menu was simple. Burgers, sandwiches, pie that looked homemade. Rita ordered coffee and felt herself begin to relax for the first time in months. What happens now? She asked after the waitress had taken their orders. With Carson Hayes, I mean. Will he face charges for what Veronica did? That depends, Robert said carefully, on whether the insurance company wants to pursue fraud charges, on whether the prosecutor's office wants to admit they charged an innocent woman without proper investigation, on how much Carson cares about his reputation versus how much he's willing to expose Veronica's problems. My guess? James leaned back in the booth. He'll pay back the insurance money quietly, claim it was all a misunderstanding, and hope the story dies. People like Carson Hayes don't face real consequences. They just write checks to make problems disappear. Rita felt something bitter twist in her stomach. So he gets away with it, with trying to destroy my life. Not entirely, Robert said. We could file a civil suit for false accusation, defamation, emotional distress. Make him pay in the only language he understands. Rita considered it. 3 months ago, she would have jumped at the chance to make Carson Hayes suffer even a fraction of what she'd endured. But now, sitting in this warm restaurant with her sons, the idea felt exhausting. More court dates, more lawyers, more time spent focused on a man who'd already taken too much from her. No, she said finally. I don't want revenge. I just want to move forward. James nodded slowly. Your choice, Mom. But if you change your mind, the option's there. Their food arrived, and for a while they ate in comfortable silence. Rita watched her sons, really watched them, and saw the men they'd become. James had his father's mannerisms, the way he tilted his head when thinking deeply. Robert had inherited her stubbornness, that set to his jaw that meant he'd made up his mind about something. They were hers and their own at the same time, and the realization made her chest ache with love so intense it hurt. "Did Hayes really never ask about us?" Robert said eventually, setting down his coffee cup. "In 15 years. Rita thought back through countless mornings arriving at the mansion, afternoons spent polishing furniture and scrubbing bathrooms, evenings when she'd stayed late for dinner parties and events. "He asked twice," she said. "Once when I requested time off for your high school graduation, he wanted to know why I couldn't just attend the ceremony and come back to work afterward. Didn't understand that I wanted to spend the whole day with you." "And the second time?" James prompted. "When you broke your arm in 10th grade. Rita looked at him. "I came in late because I'd been at the hospital with you all night." Carson was annoyed. He said I should arrange my personal life so it doesn't interfere with my professional responsibilities. Robert's hand tightened around his fork. "You were with your injured son." He didn't see it that way. To him, I was staff who'd inconvenienced him by having a life outside his house. Rita took a sip of coffee, the bitterness matching her mood. "I stopped mentioning you after that. Stopped talking about my life at all. It was easier to be invisible." "You made yourself invisible so we could be visible," James said quietly. "So we could go to good schools, have opportunities, build lives that didn't require that kind of sacrifice." "I'd do it again," Rita said simply. "Every bit of it, because look at you now." They finished their meal, and James insisted on paying despite Rita's protests. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. They stood on the sidewalk for a moment, none of them quite ready for the day to end. "Come stay with us tonight," Robert said suddenly. "We'll order takeout, watch something mindless on TV, just be together. You shouldn't be alone after today." Rita wanted to say yes. Wanted to go home with her sons and pretend they could go back to being the unit they'd once been, when they were all she had, and she was all they needed. But they had their own lives now, their own routines and responsibilities. She couldn't keep leaning on them forever. "I'll be okay," she said. "You've done enough. More than enough." "Mom," James said, and his voice carried a hint of exasperation. "Let us take care of you. Just for tonight." Rita looked at her sons, at the genuine concern in their faces, and felt something inside her give way. Maybe it was okay to accept help. Maybe strength didn't always mean handling everything alone. "Okay," she said softly. "Just for tonight." They drove to Brooklyn, to a neighborhood Rita had never visited before. The apartment building was modest but well-maintained, with a doorman who greeted James and Robert by name. Inside, their apartment was small but comfortable. Hardwood floors, mismatched furniture that looked salvaged from different sources, bookshelves crammed with legal texts and novels. It smelled like coffee and the particular scent of young men living on their own, not quite matching her standards of clean, but close enough. "It's not much," Robert said, seeming suddenly self-conscious. "We're saving most of our income to eventually start our own practice." "It's perfect," Rita said honestly, because it was theirs. Evidence of the life they'd built, the future they were creating. Everything she'd worked for made visible in these small rooms. They ordered Chinese food and ate it straight from the containers, sitting on the couch with a movie playing that none of them really watched. Instead, they talked. About work, about plans, about small memories from years past. James told a story about Rita teaching them to ride bikes in a parking lot, how she'd run alongside them for hours until her legs ached. Robert reminded her of the time she'd worked overnight shifts for 2 weeks straight to afford birthday presents they'd wanted desperately. "You were always there," James said. "Even when you were exhausted, Even when you were working multiple jobs, you were there. Every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every time we needed you." "I missed things too," Rita said, old guilt surfacing. "Games, practices, afternoons when you came home to an empty apartment because I was still working." "You were there when it mattered," Robert said firmly. "And you taught us something more important than being at every event. You taught us what it means to work for something, to sacrifice for people you love, to keep going when everything's hard." Rita felt tears prick her eyes. "I just wanted you to have better than I had." "We do," James said simply. "Because of you." Night deepened outside the windows. Eventually, Robert set up the couch with blankets and pillows for Rita, and her sons disappeared into their respective bedrooms. Rita lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the apartment settling, the distant traffic outside, the quiet breathing of the city at night. She thought about Carson Hayes, wondering if he was awake too, dealing with the fallout of his failed prosecution. She thought about Veronica, wherever she was hiding, unable to face the questions she couldn't answer. She thought about Patricia Kendrick and Gerald Hoffman, about journalists writing stories that would paint Rita as either victim or vindicated, never quite capturing the complexity of what had actually happened. But mostly, she thought about her sons, about the way they'd walked into that courtroom like they owned it, about the fierce protectiveness in their voices when they'd defended her, about the men they'd become despite, or perhaps because of, everything she'd put them through in pursuit of their futures. Rita had spent 15 years being invisible in Carson Hayes' mansion, making herself small so her employers could feel large, accepting that her worth was measured in the cleanliness of their floors and the shine of their crystal. But she'd never been invisible to her sons. They'd seen her. They'd always seen her. Not as a maid or a servant or a convenient target for false accusations, but as what she'd always been, their mother, the woman who'd sacrificed everything, asked for nothing, and given them the tools to stand up not just for themselves but for her. The charges were dropped. The case was over. Tomorrow, Rita would wake up and figure out what came next, whether to look for another cleaning job or try something different, whether to stay in the city or move somewhere cheaper, whether to accept her son's offers of help or insist on remaining independent. Tomorrow, there would be decisions to make and a life to rebuild. But tonight, she lay in her son's apartment, wrapped in blankets they'd given her, safe and free and surrounded by evidence of the life she'd made possible. And for the first time in 3 months, maybe longer, Rita Morales felt something she'd almost forgotten. Peace. When morning came, Rita woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of her sons moving around the kitchen. She found them both dressed for work, James making toast while Robert scrambled eggs with the intense focus he'd always brought to any task. "You didn't have to do this," Rita said from the doorway. "We wanted to," Robert said without looking up from the stove. "Besides, when's the last time we all had breakfast together?" They ate at the small kitchen table, and Rita marveled at how normal it felt. How easy. Her sons talked about their day ahead, meetings and briefs and depositions, while Rita listened and asked questions, and felt pride swell in her chest all over again. "What will you do today?" James asked as they cleaned up. Rita considered the question. Yesterday, she'd been a woman accused of theft, standing alone in a courtroom facing destruction. Today, she was free. The difference felt enormous and disorienting. "I don't know," she admitted. "I haven't thought past the trial." "Take your time," Robert said. "Figure out what you want, not just what you need. For once in your life, put yourself first." "I don't know how to do that," Rita said honestly. "Learn," James said with a slight smile. "You've got time now. And if you need anything, money, a place to stay, Just someone to talk to. We're here. Always. Rita hugged them both before they left for work, holding on perhaps a moment too long, breathing in the reality of them. Then she was alone in their apartment with the whole day stretching ahead and no obligations pulling her in any direction. She cleaned first, because that's what she knew how to do. Washed the dishes, wiped down counters, straightened the living room. But she did it for herself, because she wanted the space to be nice, not because someone was paying her or judging her worth by how thoroughly she scrubbed. Then she sat with a cup of coffee and looked out the window at Brooklyn waking up. People heading to work, children walking to school, the ordinary rhythm of life that had continued despite her personal storm. The world hadn't stopped for her trial, and it wouldn't stop for her freedom either. Life just kept moving, indifferent and relentless. Rita thought about Carson Hayes and his mansion, about Veronica and her secrets, about 15 years spent invisible. She thought about Patricia Kendrick's cool assessment and Gerald Hoffman's confident prosecution, and every person who'd looked at her and seen only a convenient story. She thought about how close she'd come to being convicted, to becoming another statistic of a system that favored people with money and power. But she also thought about her sons walking through those courtroom doors, about the way they'd defended her with such fierce certainty, about how they'd used everything she'd given them, education, determination, the understanding of what injustice looked like, and turned it into a weapon that had saved her. Rita had spent years making herself small, but she'd raised her sons to be big, to take up space, to speak with authority, to stand up for what was right, even when it was hard. She'd given them that. The inverse of her own life, the opposite of her own experience. And in doing so, she'd created the very thing that had rescued her when she needed it most. Her phone buzzed. A text from James. "How are you doing?" Rita smiled and typed back, "Good. Really good." And she meant it. Not because everything was perfect or solved or easy, but because for the first time in a very long time, Rita Morales felt like more than the sum of her jobs and obligations. She felt like herself, visible, valued, and finally free to figure out what that meant. The future was uncertain, but uncertainty felt different now, not like a threat, but like possibility. And that, Rita thought as she finished her coffee and stood to face the day, was worth more than all the diamonds in Carson Hayes' safe.